Tonight we have the pleasure of hosting two remarkable talents. A man who contains multitudes, novelist, singer, songwriter, and cabinet of wonders purveyor and maestro, Wesley Stace, will be in conversation with an author who has graced our stage no less than 8 times in the preceding 20 years. What is left to say about a writer whose illustrious achievements are common knowledge, who has won the most esteemed prizes the world over, whose honorifics include the monikers Commander, President, Chairman, and Knight, whose honorary degrees span continents and cultures, whose work has been translated into more than 40 languages, into plays, an opera, a film, and a popular song. I say, welcome back, Salman Rushdie and Wesley Stace, to the Free Library of Philadelphia.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Salman Rushdie.
Hello. Here we are again.
It's his 8th time.
Yeah, I know. I was getting practiced. All right, yeah.
So we're here, ostensibly, mostly, to talk about Mr. Rushdie's new book, Quichotte, which is the French for Don Quixote. And so why don't we just open off with just asking what I won't ask anything as silly as what drew you to the story of Don Quixote, as people, that keeps happening to people for centuries now. Yeah. But what was the germ of the idea of doing your version of it?
Well, it was kind of an accident, really. I mean, what I had been thinking of was to write a kind of journey book, a book that I was very conscious of the fact that the previous 2 novels had taken place almost entirely in New York City. And even while I was writing the previous one, The Golden House, I was thinking about this because I thought, you have to leave town. You can't write another book that operates inside the 212 area code. You have to go somewhere. And so I'd been thinking about that. And actually, initially, I thought I might write a nonfiction book. And I thought I might write a book in which I took the trip across America and whatever happened. And in fact, I mean, in the novel, my Quichotte has a sort of teenage kid along with him, son. And I actually asked my, now 22-year-old, but then I guess 18-year-old son, if he would like to go with me, because I thought it might be interesting to have a younger generation's take on whatever we saw. And he said, yeah, he would be interested. And then, after a kind of comic pause, he said, but Dad, are you going to drive? And I was indignant, I said, I've been driving since before you were born. What are you talking about? And he said, no, I don't think you should drive. And then he said that he would drive, and so I fired him and decided to write a novel instead. Actually, realistically, I came to think that I didn't want to deny myself the use of my imagination, because you could make a journey and nothing interesting happens, and then you're left with not much of a book. So I thought this way I could at least make sure that interesting things happen. So, and then by a complete coincidence, I was asked to write something about Cervantes. This was about 4.5 years ago, when it was about to be the 400th anniversary of both Cervantes and Shakespeare. And somebody asked me to write a piece which compared and contrasted these 2 gigantic figures. And I hadn't read Don Quixote for, decades, And so I thought before I write this thing, I better read it. And what had happened in the interim is that a much better translation had arrived.
That big red one.
That Edith Grossman translation. Yeah. And it's so much better that it was as if I was reading a new book, and it had actually a bigger impact on me rereading than when I had first read it. In the old days, when the Penguin Classics translation, the standard translation was, to be frank, a little dull, a little turgid. And I hadn't entirely fallen in love with the book. But this time I did. And then I thought, almost immediately, these 2 characters of mine who are like Quixote and Sancho Panza, but they're actually also not like Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. They kind of popped into my head, and I thought, oh, well, these are wonderful people to see the world through, you know, and so it happened like that. It happened, you know, this is what happens, though, with books, I think, that as often as you choose the idea, it chooses you. You know, it comes to you, and you find yourself with it, and then you think, oh, yeah, I'll do this. You know, so it happened in that series of accidents, you know, brought it about, not car accidents.
Well, we'll get back to the son in a moment and how you managed to fictionalize him. But of course, you getting out there into America enables you, we can dwell on any of these topics, but enables you to write, there's a little element of Lolita about the kind of motel to motel aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, actually, I really was thinking about Nabokov, because I think that's the best bit of Lolita, the bit in the middle when they're going through kind of motel land.
That was very reminded me a lot of that.
Yeah, so I mean, I was, not surprisingly, because I was thinking about it and stealing it.
And there's also a Pynchonesque, it allows you to get out in America and write about Americans and contemporary political attitudes. There's definitely a political aspect to the novel.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I used to love Thomas Pynchon. I mean, he was one of my writers, you know. I mean, in particular, V, I always thought was wonderful. I mean, I am one of the people who finished Gravity's Rainbow, which not everybody did. And I mean, I like it, but I like V more, and I like The Crying of Lot 49. These days, I don't know, I've gone off Pynchon a bit.
Well, there was an odd, I will just point out, if anybody's seen the movie Knives Out, there's a very odd mention of Gravity's Rainbow right in the middle of the night. They discuss Gravity's Rainbow.
Well, I can tell you something. I'm one of the few people who has met Thomas Pynchon. I had dinner with Thomas Pynchon, and he was very satisfyingly Pynchonesque. He was exactly what you would want Thomas Pynchon to be, you know, very, very tall and skinny, with like Albert Einstein white hair, and kind of Bugs Bunny front teeth, and which we know because almost the only photograph of him that exists is from Cornell, where he has these very prominent front teeth. He still has those. And he was wonderful, actually. He's a union guy. He talked about American unionism a lot. And, you know, his first job, he worked for Boeing, writing manuals, you know. And so he joined, you know, there's the writers' union, but then there's another writers' union for people who write technical manuals. And he joined that. and he still goes to their meetings. And they don't know who he is, you know. He's just sort of crazy Tom in the back, you know. Anyway, so yeah, I met Pynchon.
And I think the other known photograph of Thomas Pynchon is a pallbearer at Richard Farina's funeral.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yeah. So here's a line from the book, because while I was thinking about you driving across America and the various opportunities that affords you in this book, he tried to explain the picaresque tradition, its episodic nature, and how the episodes of such a work could encompass many manners, high and low, fabulous and commonplace, how it could be at once parodic and original, and so through its metamorphic roguery it could demonstrate and seek to encompass the multiplicity of human life.
Yes.
You wrote that. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. I wrote that because in the novel there's two storylines. There's the main storyline, which is the storyline of this crazy old fool who calls himself Quichotte as a kind of pseudonym, and his teenage son, who he's kind of imagined into being by magical means, literally by wishing on a star. And their journey across America, because he's had his brain affected by watching too much crappy television, and he's fallen in love with a woman on the TV, you know, a woman called Miss Salma R., whose name mysteriously is one consonant short of mine. Some curious accident.
That is weird.
It is unusual, right? Yes. And he decides that she must be his, and so they're traveling across America so that he can win her hand. And even though this is impossible because she's on TV. He's never met her. And she's super famous and powerful and charismatic and rich and famous and young, none of which he is. And yet he is not in any sense deterred. He says repeatedly that he's sure that love will find a way. And so there's that. See, there's that kind of crazy story. But not quite alternating, but along with that, there's this other story of the character who is supposed to be the author of the Quixote story.
Right.
And his story. And what we see is him, in a way, wrestling with the business of creating the main story. And things that are important in his own life being him writing about them in a kind of transformed way in the story that he's trying to tell us. And that paragraph that you read is him, the ostensible author, trying to explain to somebody what he's trying to do, which, of course, is my way of cheating by telling you what I'm trying to do. So there we are.
Well, and so the two strands, just to be totally clear for those who haven't read it, the two strands are basically Quixote and his imaginary Pinocchio-like son who he wishes upon a star and into being, who suddenly materializes as a 13-year-old boy.
Yeah, and who's sort of trying desperately to be real in a very Pinocchio-like way. So it's like Pinocchio meets Don Quixote.
And meanwhile, you have the brother, the author, thinking about his family and his series of novels. And even as he is writing the Don Quixote story, what's also happening is the characters in that story are becoming aware, particularly the son, of their being in control, being controlled by someone.
Somebody else, yes.
A narrator.
Which is a thing that actually does a little bit happen in Cervantes' book.
Well, explain what we just saw today.
Well, we just went to, thanks to Wes, we went to see the original first edition of Don Quixote in the original binding, which we saw at the Rosenbach Museum, which is amazing stuff they have there. And of course, what happened, and they have a copy, Cervantes wrote book one, what is now book one of Don Quixote, which he thought was the whole book. He wasn't planning to write anything else. And then the book was so popular that people started faking it. And particularly one writer who we don't know his real name, the pen name he uses is Avellaneda, wrote what he said was the second part of Don Quixote. And Cervantes was so furious about this that he thought that he wrote the second part of Don Quixote in order to obliterate the fake. And actually, the truth is that we owe a debt to the fake because the second part of Don Quixote is better than the first part. But what is amazing about it is in book two of Don Quixote, Quixote and Sancho become aware of the fact that they are characters in books. And they have very strong opinions about the books they're characters in. This one's good, that one's crap, etc. So, so amazingly, this is the early 17th century. It's 400 years ago. He invented metafiction and postmodernism, and so in a way, the fact that my fictional writers, fictional characters, become aware that they're the creations of something, which might be God, or might just be a novelist. I thought that was just an enjoyable game to play.
But also, while we are actually following those two stories, because it's one of your novels, what we're also experiencing are the backstories of many other characters in the book, the various emigre Indian business people, the TV host, the brother, their family in India.
There's more characters. There's more major characters than you would normally expect to find in a novel, partly because of this doubling, of the story. But for example, the character of the talk show host, Miss Salma R, with whom he falls in love. He doesn't know her. What he sees is what he sees on television, and on television, she's perfect. She's divine, and he thinks of her as kind of a goddess, but when we, in the novel, meet her and learn about her life, we discovered that that's very far from being the case. That she's actually had quite a hard life, where both her mother and her grandmother had mental health issues, and she herself suffers from a kind of bipolar condition, and has become, partly because of the bipolar condition, has become an opioid addict, and is very keen on Oxy and Vicodin and Percocet and related things. And so actually her life is quite hard, and so behind the perfection is reality, and I wanted the reader to be able to see that, that the thing on the screen is an illusion.
And of course, Don Quixote has had his mind addled by romances,
by bad novels.
In Cervantes, and you talk about here, it's Jason in the Argo and Sir Galahad and the Knights of the Round Table. His head is full of this nonsense. The Journey of the 30 Birds to Simurgh the Burgod, and in a way, your main character has been addled by television.
Yeah, I did think if Cervantes believed that the dreadful literature of his time was literally rotting the brain of his character, and by extension of the culture, and I thought, well, if he was around now, what would his target be? It wouldn't be romantic fiction,
or literary fiction.
Or literary fiction. What would it be? And I thought, well, it would probably be reality television, because it has rotted our brains to the extent that we have a reality television president. And so I thought that would be his target. And so, unfortunately, having made that decision, I had to start watching it.
I'm not falling for that excuse at all. The old research excuse.
No, it's really true, because I'm not somebody who watches the Bravo network very often. I don't watch bachelors and bachelorettes and Kardashians and real or unreal housewives of various locations. I don't think there is one from Philadelphia, is there? But there's, Atlanta.
Jersey.
I thought the Real Housewives of Atlanta were kind of close to being fun.
Right.
But not really. Anyway, I thought, I don't know anything about this stuff, but if I'm going to write a novel whose main character is obsessed by it, then I have to know what's in his head. I can't fake it. I have to know what's in it. So I had to watch substantial amounts of these things. And all I can say is, I felt them rotting my brain.
And this book is the evidence.
And this book is the evidence. What I thought is, I'm not wrong. I can actually feel it happening, And now I don't have to watch it anymore.
Well, if you're not going to read any of your book, I'll just read this little bit for you.
Read a bit.
He devoured morning shows, daytime shows, late-night talk shows, soaps, situation comedies, lifetime movies, hospital dramas, police series, vampire and zombie serials, the dramas of housewives from Atlanta, New Jersey, Beverly Hills, and New York, the romances and quarrels of hotel fortune princesses and self-styled shahs, the cavortings of individuals made famous by happy nudities, the 15 minutes of fame according to young persons with large social media followings on account of their plastic surgery acquisition of a third breast, or their post-rib removal figures that mimic the impossible shape of the Mattel company's Barbie doll, or even more simply, their ability to catch giant carp in picturesque settings, wearing only the thinnest of string bikinis.
I met her.
The carp?
No, the woman with the carp. I was on a German TV show. The biggest late-night German talk show, where there's like 3 or 4 guests. One of them was a government minister, one of whom was somebody else, some industrialist. One was me, and then there was this girl. And I said to the host, I said, what's she doing? And he says, well, she has like 27.5 million followers on Instagram. And I said, what does she do? And he said, well, she catches fish. And Instagram was all literally pictures of her standing like up to here in a lake, wearing a very skimpy bikini, holding a giant carp. And as somebody said to me, the carp is a very slow, foolish fish. It's actually really easy to catch. So it wasn't even that she was doing anything complicated. You have to reach into the water and scoop it out. Anyway, so I met
I wonder
her.
what the appeal was.
Yeah.
But you know, when you mentioned the opioid crisis,
Yeah.
this is also a book that feels to me like it's got its eye right on where America is now.
No,
The people in it, the people running it, it's kind of patron saints of the day. And one character I'd like to mention, because I enjoyed it so much, was the interview with the celebrated American scientist, entrepreneur, and billionaire of Indian origin, Evil Scent. The name Evil Scent was, as you know, and so he turns out to be the more Indian-sounding Awal Sant. And there's no prizes for guessing who he is, but
Well,
you look. It is full of that contemporary commentary.
I did meet Elon Musk once, and the thing about him is he's very difficult to get him to talk to you. He's not a chatty fellow, and so we're sitting at lunch table with all kinds of very illustrious people, you know, Katie Couric, Ron Howard, etc. And Katie Couric's husband says to him, "So, Mars, you're really interested in Mars?" "Yes." and you think it's really feasible that human beings could go there and make a colony there? "Yes." And he said, "Well, how long do you think that's going to take? Because that sounds like, you know, a long-term project." And he said, 7 years. And Katie Couric's husband said, "But 7 years, that's like the day after tomorrow. Are you sure that 7 years, is that realistic?" "Yes." Anyway, I thought, if he's not going to talk to me, I'm going to have fun with him. And I turned him into this Indian entrepreneur scientist.
And
Sorry, Elon.
if it's one of your novels, there is. You say it's a way of almost explaining to the reader what you're doing, and perhaps also depicting the creation of you doing it. But there's always going to be an element of postmodern, self-reflexiveness.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think in theory language, you know. So I don't think postmodern or metafiction or etc. I don't use that language to myself.
No.
I'm just trying to think of what is the best way of saying what I need to say and telling the story I need to tell. And sometimes that becomes self-conscious, yes. Sometimes the story knows that it's telling a story, you know, and tells you about the kind of story it's telling. Mm-hmm. You know? But it's not a theory, it's just a useful device at a certain moment.
Yes, I see that. Okay, yes.
Yeah.
But you do often do it.
Yeah.
And that makes me think, I mean, obviously, we know some of your literary influences, but I just wonder why it's something that one is likely to find there in the mix.
I don't know. I think it's just the way it comes out. I mean, I think I've become very interested, and actually as I've got older, I got more and more interested in the question of clarity, in the question of leaving the reader in no doubt about what I'm getting at and trying to do, you know. And so sometimes I find devices by which I can clarify that in the course of the text, you know. And it's really just to make the reading experience fuller, I think, really, you know, that I don't want people to think, well, I didn't completely get that. I want them to completely get it, you know, and so sometimes I give them a little help, you know. There are people who accuse my books of being complicated, a thing I don't understand. I don't think they're more complicated than life, if you know what I mean. I think human life is quite complicated and messy, you know, and has elements that come at you from all directions, you know, and unexpectedly and so on. And so I think there's no harm for a book to reflect that, as long as you stay in control of it. But the thing you said, I wanted to say something about the very contemporary milieu of the book, the fact that the fact that it's written like right up against the present moment, which is very deliberately is doing that. I mean, that's something you're kind of told not to do. If you do what I never did, which is to learn how to write. I mean, I never did a creative writing course or studied literature, you know. You're told not to do that, that you're told that you need to have perspective and distance and so on, and otherwise you can't really get to grips with your material, you know. And I mean, there's a lot of truth in that. But there's also an enormous excitement about going right up against the present moment. And there are plenty of books, I mean, very great books, which have done so successfully. I mean, The Great Gatsby is a book like that, you know, which is written about exactly the moment in which it's being written, you know. The Age of Innocence is like that, you know, in a very different way. So there are moments when writers, great writers, have managed to do that and kind of capture that moment for all time. You know, so now you can't think about the so-called Jazz Age without thinking about Fitzgerald, you know, for example. So that's the challenge is it's very, very hard to do it. Because if you do it wrong, then your book very rapidly becomes irrelevant like yesterday's newspapers. You know? And if you do it right, then you have that chance of capturing the moment.
And also, if you do it wrong, everybody's got something to say about it at that point.
Exactly,
you know.
exactly. There's a wonderful thing that I always think about in this context. There's in one of Hemingway's bullfighting books, I think Death in the Afternoon, but I'm not sure. He says something like, the great matador works closest to the bull. You know, let's say if the bull is over there, not so difficult, and also not so exciting to watch. If the bull is brushing your thigh as it goes past you, then every movement you make has to be exact. Otherwise, you end up with a horn in your side, you know, and that's not good. But if you do it, the crowd likes it. You know, and I mean, actually, I hate bullfighting, but I use it as a metaphor here. And I think this business of working up against the present moment is kind of like that. It's working close to the bull. You know, and if you do it wrong, you get the horn in your side.
Yeah.
And if you do it right, everybody cheers. You know, so there we are. I mean, so I have a couple of times, I mean, actually Midnight Children is a book that did that came right up to the moment in which it was being written. I mean, so much so that the end of the novel, which deals with the period known in India as the emergency, which was in the mid-70s when Mrs. Gandhi suspended democracy for just under 3 years. I'm writing the book, and it's during the emergency. And I thought, I don't want the book to end in this moment, you know, this dark moment. But I thought I can't end it in the book if it hasn't ended in the world. You know? And then she called an election overconfident and lost it. And I was so grateful. She just she just gave me the end of my book. You know, I wanted to send her a thank you telegram, and then I thought maybe not. You know, but so that thing about coming right up against the moment, you know, is something I seem to have been doing since the beginning. You know, and I'm attracted to it.
And also, I mean, I think we all know from having read so many bad attempts at what used to be called the Zeitgeist novel. I mean, that's you know, there are so, you read, you know, it's harder to find a good one.
Yeah, they're all awful.
They're all awful.
Yeah, and so that's the danger. The danger is that you could be in that category called they're all awful. Which, I mean, I hope it's not.
Here we go. Do you think as I said earlier, Quixote, never goes away. The first time I was exposed to it, apart from the musical, you know, Man from La Mancha, was when I saw Nureyev dancing in a ballet in Paris when I was very young. And then there's going to be a Terry Gilliam, if it's not already out.
It is out. It's not very good.
Okay. But, what
was very good was the documentary he made about not being able to make
fantastic.
the film. Lost in La Mancha, that's wonderful.
Yes.
But now that he's actually found in La Mancha, it's not so great.
Yeah. Because it's better when he's tilting at the windmills than when he's making
Yes, because he himself is he's Don Quixote, you know, Terry.
Yeah.
He has the same kind of lunacy, sort of lunatic genius of the great character.
What do you, I mean, it's a very broad question, so go anywhere you like with it, but what do you think is that has made it such an incredibly archetypal?
Oh, yeah, and I think, I mean, look, first of all, the two of them, Quixote and Sancho Panza, are wonderfully balanced characters, you know, head in the clouds, feet on the ground, you know, and they go together very well. One is all dreams, and the other is all earthiness, you know, and although they're both deeply stupid, they also have an irresistible sweetness to them. You know, we are very, very fond of them, you know, and I wanted my characters to have that as well, even though they're different. I mean, Sancho in my story is not Sancho Panza. He's a teenage boy, as we were saying, you know, but what I discovered, and the Sancho character is quite mutinous and,
Yeah.
you know, kind of annoying teenager, a breed of which I
Less
have.
lovable. One might
Less
say.
lovable, except if you've ever had teenage boys, in which case you know that that's what they're like. I have deep experience of teenage boys, so one of whom I fired, you know, from the sea above. Anyway, but my Quichotte, you see, Cervantes' Quichotte is mournful. He's melancholy. You know, he's known as the Knight of the Dolorous Countenance. You know, he has a sad face. From the moment I started writing my character, he was ludicrously optimistic.
Yeah.
You know, he was very hopeful. He approached the world with hope. You know, and I thought I want that to go out into America. You know, at what may not be the most optimistic moment in the history of this country, but to approach it with optimism, to approach everybody he meets with a positive spirit and expecting a positive thing back from them, you know, and being disappointed when he doesn't get it, but not defeated by it and then not changing his way, you know. I just thought that would be much more affecting than just having somebody being depressed about everything, you know, which would not be unreasonable, you know, but not interesting, you know. So that sweetness, which is absolutely true about Cervantes' characters. In a different way, I wanted that to be true about mine as well, that you feel fond of them. You feel, you know, you're kind of rooting for them. And I think in Don Quixote, you're very much rooting for him, even though you know that he's mad. And also the other thing is that gradually, as the great book goes on, you begin to feel that the world is crazier than him.
Right.
You know, and that by the time you get towards the end of the book, he almost feels like the most sane person in the world. And I thought, well, that for sure is true now. You know, you go out into the world, it's mad out, it's crazy out, wild out there. You know?
And he meets all those things. I mean, they're nearly lynched in one place.
Yeah. And I mean, look, these are immigrants. Most of the major characters are Indian American immigrants, you know, and certainly he is. And I thought you can't, in this day and age, send a couple of brown-skinned people across Middle America and expect that they will not encounter any hostility. You know, it's just that would be a cop-out, I thought. And I thought I don't want the book to be, you know, kind of, as it were, a tract about racism, but I don't want to duck the subject either, you know. And so I think there's 4 incidents in the book of different levels of risk. You know, a couple of times it's just somebody being rude, you know, but and then a couple of times it's more physically dangerous. But I thought sadly, that's true, you know. And one of the things it came from, and one of the true stories it came from, was of which there's a version in the book, was a killing that happened in Kansas, where some crazy guy walks into a bar and shoots 2 Indian American software engineers who are having a drink, and one of them's killed and the other one survives. And I saw an interview with the widow of the dead man, and very affecting, in which she said, how they'd lived in this town for, 20-odd years, and they'd raised their children there, and they thought of themselves as, as totally American, and then this happens, and she said, so now it makes me think, is there a place for us here? And that question, is there a place for us here, really stuck with me. And actually, there's a character in the book who asks that question. And I thought, the book needs to ask that question, and then come up with some sort of answer for it.
Things get, we're coming to the end of the conversational point, and then we're going to be opening it up for questions in just a little while, not quite yet. Tell us a little bit about the Ionesco.
Oh.
Ionesco, because there's that great bit after, when he explains to his son, I suppose, what
it's about.
What's kind of happened in that. Which is what and his son says, is that okay to do, that kind of borrowing? Because what you've borrowed is
rhinoceros. When I was, there's a moment in the novel which is almost a kind of parenthesis in the novel. It's a little chapter where they turn off the road and they have this experience.
It's just before they get to New York.
And just before they get to
New
New York. It's in New Jersey where such things happen. And they turn off just before they get to the tunnel. They turn off to a fictional town called Beringer, New Jersey, which is approximately where Weehawken would be, but isn't really. And they discover that people are turning into mastodons, which as far as I know, is not happening in the New Jersey area at this time.
And you say it's a parenthesis, but in fact it feels thematically very linked to what's around it.
It's really the kind of microcosm of the book,
Yeah.
And where it came from was when I was at college, and I was at 19 or something, I was cast in a student production of Eugene Ionesco's great play, Rhinoceros. Rhinoceros is a farce. The whole play is played at very, very fast. People running on and off stage. And people are turning, in this small town in provincial France, people are turning into rhinoceroses for unexplained reasons. And I wasn't the lead or anything. I was just one of the people running on and off stage. Every time you ran off stage, a stagehand would stick a bit more rhinoceros on you, and then you'd come out and you'd be a bit more rhinoceros. And I was 19, and I kind of didn't understand the play. And I said to the producer, I said, what's this about? And he, rather kindly, he said to me, Salman, it's about fascism. And I said, how is it about fascism? And he said, well, it's saying that what can happen at certain moments in history, in a community or in a country, is that the people who are your next door neighbors can suddenly begin to seem monstrous to you. That you feel so alienated from them or they from you that you can't understand what they're saying or their behavior, and they seem scary. It's about that. And I remember at 19 thinking, oh, that's very clever. And also what was clever about it was that the play never, at any moment, becomes didactic. Its manner is relentlessly farcical. All that's happening is crazy stuff, which makes you laugh. But underneath the making you laugh, there is this very serious thing. And so I thought, well, maybe to some degree we're there again. Maybe we're at a moment where, and not only in America, by the way, where we're so alienated from one another that some of us seem monstrous to others of us. And so then I thought, okay, well, I can do this, but I can't have rhinoceroses because he's got rhinoceroses.
Yeah, no.
So I thought mastodons, they're funny too.
And also, it's good about that way in which those things happen gradually, piece by piece,
yes,
until suddenly they're that way entirely.
Exactly. There's some of them who are only half mastodon,
Yeah.
and they kind of look like Barbara the elephant, with like green suits.
Yeah.
And they're possibly rescuable because they haven't completely gone over to the other side, and maybe you could win them back to the human race, although improbable.
Right.
because they're mostly Mastodon. Anyway, so it became for me a little...
You've clearly thought about it.
Yes, yes. It became a little, almost perfect little comedy metaphor for what I was trying to say was happening in the whole book. It feels like it's an aside. It feels like you turn off the road, you have that little adventure, and then you turn back on the road and you go where you were really going. But secretly, it's kind of the heart.
It's a beautiful little breather as well just before they enter New York, because you know that that it's all going to happen when they get to New York, because they've traveled across the country to get there. And I would like to say that it's an extremely funny book, very lightly written, and a book that in so many different parts of it, I'll just mention that the piece with the chess piece to you, that resolves so beautifully, as it does indeed at the end of the book when you find out, what Quixote's been doing for a living and what the result of that is and who he's been, it's just beautifully done.
Well, the one thing I knew about this book with the two storylines was that for it to be a really satisfying reading experience, that gradually the storylines have to get closer and closer.
Yeah.
And you can see how one echoes or illuminates the other and so on, and how variations of things happening in one storyline are happening in the other one. But I knew that somehow, by the end of the book, I had to join the storylines. I had to bring them really together, and I had no idea how to do it. I was quite scared of how to do it, of not knowing how to do it. And then by one of these, serendipitous miracles, which is the beauty of writing, is that if you just hammer at it for long enough, you wake up one day and you think, oh, that's how you do it. And then you do it, and it feels satisfying, And it just came out of the blue. I spent a lot of nights worrying about, I don't know how to finish the book, and then I found it.
And it answers itself so perfectly, the way it resolves with that structure, and seems to mirror itself from beginning to end. So, thank you so much for talking to me, Salman.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. In listening to you talk about coming up against the moment and mastodons, etc., and who you are and who you've been, I can't help but thinking of Kashmir now and of Modian. Do you have any views to help us?
I don't have any views to help you. I mean, I have views. Well, look, my family is Kashmiri, so for me it's, it matters a lot what's happening there. To put it at its simplest, I think India is in the process of ceasing to be a democracy, and is turning into something much darker than that, and Kashmir is one manifestation of that. The thing that's happening right now, which is the changing of the citizenship laws in order to disadvantage certain groups, non-Hindu groups, from gaining citizenship, is absolutely in breach of the Indian constitution, which is a secularist constitution, and yet that's what's going to happen. So, India is I'm much more depressed about what's happening in India than I am about what's happening here. Here, I think it's reversible. It doesn't mean it will be reversed because of the ability of the Democrats to commit suicide, which is their greatest gift. A circular firing squad. Let's destroy all our candidates one by one, and then wonder why nobody beats the person whose name I won't say. But India, the problem is that while these appalling assaults on liberty and just civilization are taking place, Mr. Modi has won 2 landslide elections, and that doesn't show any sign of changing, even though the economy of the country is in very bad shape, and he came to power basically promising to be kind of good for business, good for the economy, etc. He hasn't been. And yet, what he's done is to weaponize kind of militant Hinduism, and bring with him a very large percentage of the country, you know. And so I don't see any, and they're going after people. They're going after journalists. They're going after writers and intellectuals. They're vindictive. If you stand up against them, they come after you, you know? And that's getting worse and worse. So I do think that India used to take great pride in the claim of being the world's largest democracy, you know, and in pointing out how it's much easier to be a democracy in a rich country, much harder to be a democracy in a poor country, and yet we're doing it, you know. And I don't think that's really a tenable claim anymore, you know. And it's a tragedy for people like me, people of my generation, people of my way of thinking, who grew up admiring the country that the founding fathers, that Gandhi and Nehru had brought into being. To see the destruction of that, to see members of parliament standing up and describing Mahatma Gandhi's assassin as a national hero, you know, that people are thinking about building statues to him. It's horrifying. It's horrifying and frightening. And yeah, as I said, it's not helpful, you know, but that's sort of what's going on.
Given the complexity of your stories, how do you keep track? Are you one of those authors who has charts on the wall, or to keep track of all the storylines and the characters and the development?
I have notes, you know. I have stuff both in notebooks and in computer files, which I look at all the time. But, you know, in the end, it's all in here. You know, you actually have to, I think, very largely, I don't think it's just me, I think it's anybody who writes a book, I think you have to have a lot of it, the whole matrix of it in your head, and to be able to refer to it, you know. So I guess that's just the way my brain works, you know. But yeah, I mean, I also think something's changed in my writing from when I started out, which is that I used to be much more of a kind of architecture person. You know, I used to need to have a very worked out structure before I could start putting flesh on the bones, you know. And as I've gone on, I've become much more attracted to the idea of seeing what happens on the page. And then using it or not using it, but trusting the moment of the act of creation, you know. I mean, I guess it's, in a way, the shift from thinking symphonically about something to thinking like jazz, you know, where you know, Miles stands up with his horn. He doesn't exactly know what's going to come out, you know, but he's going to go with where it's going, you know. And I'm more attracted to that now, you know. I mean, I had a good fortune many years ago when Toni Morrison published her novel, Jazz. I was living in England at the time. She was in the early 90s. And I had the opportunity to interview her on British television for an hour. And one of the most interesting hours of my life, actually. And I said to her, so your novel's called Jazz. And I said, is that how you think, is that, you know, in terms of your writing? And first she said, oh, well, that's what I'd like people to think that I'm doing. You know? But then she kind of opened up and said, no, because that novel it's a whole series of long riffs, that novel, you know, about the city or about women or about race or about all sorts of things, just long, sort of non-narrative riffs, you know. And I said, well, this reads like a kind of jazz solo, you know. And she said, yeah, that she did think like that a little bit. And I thought, well, if it's good enough for Toni Morrison, it's good enough for me, you know. So, and it made me start thinking differently about how to construct a work, you know. So, I mean, for example, the mastodons, you know. The mastodons were not part of the plan of this book. I had absolutely no plan to have anything with a trunk. intervening. And then they just showed up. They just showed up. My characters are driving down the New Jersey Turnpike, heading for the tunnel. And then they decide to rest for the night before they go to the city. So they turn off the road, and they bump into these mastodons. And I really wasn't planning it. And then when what you have to do, I think, is okay, it happens, and then you think, all right, well, I don't know what this is, but I better find out. So you explore it, but you then have to be your own toughest critic. You have to be able to say, okay, you know what? No. It doesn't belong here, and it needs to go, and you have to throw it out. But in that particular case, as you said, it just began to feel like a kind of microcosm of the rest of the book. And so then I was happy to have found it.
And also, I mean, there's sometimes when you read books by other people who aren't you and me, who you know they've come up with the idea of what they were going to write, and then they've fulfilled all that criterion. Yeah. But what often happens is the characters start to come on with a 360 degrees that mean they might not act at all in the way that you thought they would act necessarily.
Exactly. No, it happens every book I've ever written. There are characters who you think are going to be secondary, who insist on being primary, just because they won't get out of the way, And there are characters you think are going to be important who end up being less important than you thought they were going to be. There are scenes which you thought were going to be central to the book, which when you get to them, you think, oh no, I can do that in 5 lines. And other moments where you think it's a quick move across, which suddenly becomes 20 pages. So that's just what happens. That's writing. It's like that. And I've come to enjoy it more and more, to that act of discovery, to think of writing as an act of discovery rather than simply as an execution of a plan.
Fulfillment, Salman talking about, he mentioned earlier the matrix that's in his head, and he came very kindly to talk to a classroom of kids of 13 today reading Haroun in the Sea of Stories. And one of them said, is there anything you'd like to change about this book? And you said, no, because I had to kind of internalize that matrix, and now I'm not in touch with it anymore.
No, and then
because it was all there.
Yeah, because I think there's a moment when you finish a book when this thing that you're holding in your head goes away. Poof, goes away. And after that, you don't know the book in that intimate way. And then to try and change it after that is like doing brain surgery blindfolded. You can't do it. And there are people who revise their books or their poetry or whatever and make them much, much worse.
It's very rarely done
Very rarely better. I mean, John Fowles he did a rewritten version of the Magus, which was much, much worse than the already not very good.
Or Bob Dylan's new rewritten lyrics that he's doing at the moment.
I mean, somebody should stop him. Just because he won the Nobel Prize for Literature doesn't mean he knows how to revise. but there's a famous case of this, which is, Auden's great poem about the beginning of the World War II, which contains the immortal line, "We must love one another or die." When he was old, he decided, we must love one another or die. Well, that's not exactly right. We don't have to die if we don't love one another. So he rewrote it to read, we must love one another and die, which is really banal. So, I mean, yes, that's true. But so what? And so, yeah, I think there's the American literary critic, Randall Jarrell, who wrote one of my favorite...
that novel, a fantastic...
He did write a novel,
such a good book. Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, he has one of his best lines of lit crit is he says, a novel is a long piece of writing that has something wrong with it. And it's true, if you're going to, write 100,000, 150, this is about 150,000 words. I don't care how good you are, they're not going to be perfect. Perfection is a kind of delusion. You try and make it as good as you can, but the idea of it being immaculate,
But that's, you know, there always has been a certain kind of slightly Rabelaisian aspect to your writing.
Well, I like Rabelais.
And you know, and that's always reflected in your writing. So your novels are always going to have a bit of a...
Yeah. Well, see, I think there's two ways of writing good books, which you could call, roughly speaking, you can call minimalist and maximalist. You know, you can take like one beautiful storyline, you know, and kind of turn it in the light and see what it has to do, like one hair from the head of the goddess of literature, you know. Or you can try and have it all. You can try and reach out there and scoop up as much of everything as you can and put it in your book. And I've always been attracted to that kind of writing. I mean, whether it's Rabelais, whether it's Charles Dickens, you know.
Shandy.
Or, yeah, Tristram Shandy, whatever. You know, the kind of everything book. The book that tries to include as much of the world as the writer can possibly cram in. I mean, one of the things I really love about Dickens is how much of his society he feels able to write about. You know, he can write about pickpockets and archbishops and everything in between. And I think in order to do that, you have to get out of your comfort zone and go find things out. You know, so that's always been sort of the way I think about it.
And isn't it funny how many of those big Indian novels also kind of are Dickensian in that swathe across society?
Well, you've got 1.3 billion people. What are you going to do?
Well, I wanted you to discuss your involvement in the most recent season of Curb Your Enthusiasm. I thought you were so wonderful. But I was really hoping to ask you about the topic of representation, which has become sort of a contentious topic in the past few years, and what your thoughts are on, you know, the idea of who can portray who and in what way, and also the sort of new trend, I think, in some publishing houses of having sensitivity readers go over an author's text, and what you think about that development.
I don't think anybody's ever read my books for sensitivity. And I wouldn't know what to do with it if they did, frankly. But look, I'd rather talk about Curb Your Enthusiasm, actually. But quickly on the subject of, you know, appropriation, etc. My view is that anybody can write about anything. Men can write about women, women can write about men, straight people can write about gay people can write about straight people. Everybody can do everything, which doesn't mean that they can get away with doing it badly. You know, it seems to me if you're going to write about if you can't write about experiences which are not your own, then the novel is dead. You know, there simply can no longer be novels. You know, there can only be autobiographies and memoirs. You know, so to be a novelist, almost by definition, involves writing about experiences which are not your own. You know, I don't think James Joyce had ever been a cuckolded advertising salesman in Dublin, you know, or a cuckolding wife. And yet, you know, Molly Bloom, not such a bad character. The point is if you're going to step out of your own personal experience, you have to make sure you know about the experience that you're going to write about, you know. And if you don't, then people whose experience that is have every right to call you out on it, you know, and say that what you've written is crap, you know. And so, I mean, for example, when I was writing The Golden House, I have a character in that novel who is very gender conflicted and is trying to decide whether or not to transition, you know. And I mean, this is not my experience. I do know a couple of people who have transitioned, as it happens, quite successfully. But I thought, if I'm going to write about this, and I want to write about it because it's so much a thing that people are thinking about, I have to go and find out about it. Which means literally getting out of the rooms you're normally in and getting into different kinds of rooms and talking to people and learning about their learning, you know, listening, learning. And out of that knowledge, trying to write something. And then if you do it wrong, well, then people can say you did it wrong. I mean, I was actually rather proud of the fact that when that book came out, I thought this area is such a kind of landmine area that if there's one false footfall, I'm going to get my foot blown off. But actually it didn't happen. Nobody, in the age of Twitter, nobody attacked me. It's almost impossible. I thought maybe nobody read it.
I wasn't going to say.
But somebody must have read it because my bank balance says so.
So, one person just up there.
Let me say about Curb Your Enthusiasm.
Oh, and Curb Your
No.
Enthusiasm.
What happened was that Larry David called me up out of the blue. And I'd met him like 1.5 times. And we'd got on perfectly well. But I didn't know him, you know. And he rang up, he called my agents, and they put us in touch. And we got on the phone with each other, and he said, so we've had this idea, and do you want to do it? And I said, well, can I see a script? And he said, well, that's difficult because it's all improv, so there's no script. So I said, well, can you describe it? So he described it for a few minutes. And my first reaction was to think, I don't know, is this funny? You know, how funny is this? And then I thought, well, there was obviously a point in my life in which it was not funny, you know, and in which I wouldn't have dreamed of collaborating in a project like this. But I thought if we've reached the point where we can make fun of it, that feels good, you know. And so, yeah, I said, I'll do it. Plus, I really liked the show, you know. And then I went along, and I mean, I had 2 days which were kind of wonderful fun, but also kind of scary because it really is improv. And they're kind of geniuses, all of them, they're all geniuses of improv. And I thought, I don't want to be the only person in Curb Your Enthusiasm who's no good, you know. So, but, I mean, somehow I kind of got away with it. I have to say, I'm going to tell you, then we'll have another question. There's one deleted scene which I'm a bit sad about. Because there's 2 scenes. There's one where he comes to, like, my house, which is like this palace in the Hollywood Hills with like, servants, you know. There's staff, there's butlers and things. That all novelists have these houses. And there's a second scene where we go to a restaurant together. And so there's a bridging scene where we're basically leaving my house to go to the restaurant. And as we walk out, he says to me, he says, so, are there any female butlers? And I say, well, yeah, there must be some. Yes, I guess there are some female butlers, yes. And he says, because that would be better, wouldn't it? Because then there'd always be the possibility of sex. and I say, no, Larry, you don't understand. There's a rule in the butlering world. And he says, what's the rule? And I said, the rule is don't fuck the butler. Which was my line. And they cut it out.
Because it made them look bad.
No. They said afterwards, I saw the producer saying it was their most painful cut because they all liked the scene. And so on the Curb Your Enthusiasm Facebook page, they have deleted scenes, and you can see it there.
In your early work, you reflected for a long time on integrating or on the Indian English diaspora and how you fit into that world. How has your writing changed since you moved from England to America or from London to New York, other than your characters getting stuck in New York and finally escaping?
Well, I'm not exactly sure that the writing has changed in its essential concerns, because I've still never managed to write a novel which didn't have an Indian immigrant character as a central character, you know, unless the novel was set in actual India, in which case they're just Indians in India. You know? But all the books I've written which are not set in India have Indian characters at the center of them. And I just think that those are the eyes through which I see the world, you know. I mean, that's who I am. I was somebody born and raised in India who then traveled across the world, but I retain that way of seeing, to use John Berger's phrase. So, and I've sometimes tried to write a story even, not even a short story, in which the central character was not of my ethnicity. They just aren't any good, you know? So I think I'm stuck with them. I think the 1.3 billion of us plus the diaspora is a small pool from which to draw for characters, you know. But I haven't exhausted them yet, you know. So, I mean, yes, there's a difference in location. There's a difference, and of course, the difference in location brings with it a difference in subject matter, because the subject matter of America is not exactly the same as the subject matter of Europe or of England. But I mean, I think if you were to read my books in chronological order, I don't think you would see that somehow it became a different writer at a certain point. I think it's the same sensibility kind of going through life, you know, and changing in the way that we all change as we go through life. I'm not writing about the things I was writing about when I was in my 20s. You know, thank God.
Perhaps the move to America was more instrumental in the structural changes in your book from architecture, you know, a stronger architecture towards a more
maybe
jazz
that has
approach.
something to do with it. Maybe that does have something to do with it. I'm trying to think actually the book that I wrote, the last book that I wrote, sort of when I was in the process of thinking about moving to America, was The Ground Beneath Her Feet. And that was a book in which that started to happen, because it ended up being this colossal book, this is a 550-page book, and I wasn't expecting it to be. I was expecting it to be a much more contained book. But it just exploded. And I just had to go with it. You know, so it became 250,000 words instead of the kind of 100,000 I thought it might be. And that's where I began to see that sometimes if you just follow what's happening on the page, it can actually lead you to somewhere more interesting than you first thought you were going.
Which is the writing adventure that we hope you're on for many years to come.
Me too.
Will you please give a warm round of applause for Salman Rushdie?